for building frameworks for inclusive vision sciences research in Canada. And so my title slide actually has the logo of my department at CNIB, the IDEA team, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. Our tagline is knowledge and empowerment. And the visual logo is a stylized multicolored owl, an owl symbolizing knowledge and wisdom. My email address is on the title slide, and I will put it up again at the end of the presentation. And so I'm pleased to spend the time with you today. So I'm going to start by actually just adding a couple of affiliations to what Philippe had mentioned in the introduction. In addition to being Director of Research and Chief Inclusion and Accessibility Officer for CNIB, I'm also an Assistant Professor Adjunct in the Department of Ophthalmology, the Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's University, the co-chair for the Diversity Advisory Council in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and the accessibility representative for the Executive Committee of the Dean's Action Table on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion within the Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's University. All of that's to say that the space of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in research and in STEM is something that I am not just very passionate about, but also something I do as part of my job and as part of my avocation, something that I do because I genuinely love to do it. My background is in cancer genetics. I have a PhD in medical biophysics from the University of Toronto. I did postdocs in cancer genomics and experimental therapeutics. And over time, I moved from genome diagnostics into health services outcomes. And throughout my academic career, I went from basic medical research to the medical laboratory sciences space to social determinants of health research, which is what I do now. And to put another way, I went from bench research, basic research, to translational research, to clinical research, to now behavioral and psychosocial research. So there has been this evolution over the course of my academic career. Today, what I want to talk with you about is how I brought that evolution into CNIB and how we've transformed research at CNIB from biomedical to psychosocial. I want to talk with you about the growth and evolution of CNIB's Vision Sciences Research Network, which we have been really building through the efforts of my team and our collaborators over the past 3.5 years. The impact of COVID-19. I'll show you some of our research highlights because this is also a bit of a research talk. And I will conclude by talking with you about inclusion in research and why it's important. So let's start with transforming research at CNIB. I'm going to start by suggesting that vision sciences research comprises a number of discrete research areas, all of which I think we can lump under the broad term of vision sciences. And so the image on the slide is of 5 interlocking circles, and each circle is a different color and has a different label of a scientific discipline. So rehabilitation sciences is on the far left, followed by public health and epidemiology, psychosocial and behavioral sciences, technology, and then biomedical sciences. And so those are the 5 domains that I would argue are part and parcel of vision sciences research. What I was asked to do in coming in as CNIB's Director of Research 3.5 years ago was to take our focus, which was very strongly biomedical and epidemiological in 2014 to 2018 for our previous strategic plan Path to Change, and turn it into a focus on social determinants of health and quality of life for our new strategic plan, Bold Dreams, Bright Futures, which has run 2018 to actually 2023 because we've just extended it for 1 extra year because of the pandemic. And so coming back to those 5 interlocking circles, if we think about CNIB research pre-2017, we're thinking about it as epidemiology and biomedical. Today, we think about it as rehab sciences and public health and epidemiology and psychosocial and behavioral, and also a focus on technology. When I came in, my starting conditions were as follows. I had 0 full-time staff. I had 0 existing projects. I had no external funding. I had no collaborative relationships. I had no partnerships with colleges and universities, and I had no trainees. It's a great place to start. I get to start from and a blank canvas. Although I start with nothing, it also means that I have no previous baggage to work with. And so the objectives that I set out for the department were fourfold. First of all, to collaborate with the research community in measuring and understanding the impact of sight loss on social determinants of health or social inclusion within the Canadian population. And I will be specific. We were a primary data gathering research team. We collect information, we gather knowledge. And so for us, it's not just about supporting somebody else or paying somebody else to do the work, we are doing it ourselves as well. We also wanted to develop a longitudinal understanding of the impact of programmatic interventions on social determinants of health within CNIB's client population. We wanted to compile and curate a comprehensive series of metrics that documents the impact of sight loss and social determinants of health in Canada. That's a knowledge curation or knowledge translation or knowledge dissemination activity. And then we also want to educate relevant stakeholders about those key findings arising from our research endeavors. Our research department priorities for the past 3 years have been aligned very much with the strategic priorities in the 2018-2022 strat plan called Bold Dreams, Bright Futures. That strategic plan has 3 overarching objectives. The first is to boost engagement of people with sight loss in Canada in the world of work. That means we have a focus on education and employment research, unleashing the power of technology, within the sight loss community means that we have a focus on technology research. And the third pillar was access and equality, which means that we have a focus on accessibility of supports and services and integration within the healthcare continuum. So how did I actually go about doing this? How did I take a research department that was basically just me and then try to grow and transform it? And so I took a 5-pronged approach to this. First of all, through collaboration. I brought some pre-existing relationships into my role at CNIB as Director of Research, and also word of mouth collaboration. My very first word of mouth collaboration was actually Dr. Walter Wittich, because his then PhD student, who recently defended her doctoral dissertation, Dr. Natalie Martiniello, was actually a winner of a CNIB Research Award. And and Natalie and I had known each other before. And so through Natalie, I met Walter. Through Walter, I became connected to the larger research space within the Vision Sciences umbrella. We had minimal resource needs. I rely on SurveyMonkey and Zoom for the most part to do a lot of data collection, especially now during the pandemic. That's not an expensive proposition. If the organization chooses to invest additional funding, we encourage them to do so. Obviously, I tend to ask for money from my bosses all the time. But I recognize that a license for SurveyMonkey and a license for Zoom, which basically amounts to $1,500 a year, gives me an opportunity to do a lot. Student engagement is my third pillar. And this is through our collaborative networks. This is through practicum basis as well. And the student engagement that we do is inclusive. I strive to capacity build within the student population for the next generation of researchers with sight loss. And I'll come back to that later. The projects that we do are focused on the strategic plan, but I'm also very opportunistic. If something comes along that wasn't part of my original ideas that looks like it's going to align and also gets us closer to where we want to go and builds capacity and builds opportunity, I will happily pursue it with a collaborator. And we have an inclusive approach. The team is built on inclusive principles, and the research that we do is built on inclusive principles. We wish to harmonize what we do on the research side with the other half of my portfolio as Chief Inclusion and Accessibility Officer. And so we harmonize the research with IDEA principles. And so what that means is we do inclusion in research, and we also do research on inclusion. IDEA as a concept, many of you will have perhaps encountered it differently, but IDEA is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And so with those principles in mind, the build up from 2017 through 2020 is what I would call slow and steady wins the race. And so our pre-pandemic milestones, we launched the department in October of 2017. I hired or was able to recruit my first staff person to the department in April of 2018. We launched our first project, the International Levels of Employment Study, in April of 2018. Natalie was our first MyTax funded student in August of 2018. The first collaborative multi-university partnership that we had was with Queen's and Dalhousie Universities in January of 2019. We did our K-12 educational outcomes study in spring of 2019, a guide dog advocacy study, which is the first of its kind, the same year, spring of 2019. Our first Masters of Public Health practicum student from Queen's University was recruited summer of 2019. We launched our internal knowledge translation guide, Facts and Figures About Blindness in Canada, in fall of 2019. Did a collaborative study on employment with the World Blind Union in fall of 2019, and did our post-secondary education outcomes study in winter of 2020. In February of 2020, we invested a lot of time and efforts to capitalize on everything we had done to date, to apply for a research grant through Accessibility Standards Canada on building an evidence-based universal design framework for employment standards in this country. That application went in March of 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And so we had a very slow and steady build up until the start of the pandemic. I will also tell you, just to provide a bit of a spoiler, we did win that grant in August of last year, and the project started in October. And so if we look at the number of research projects that that we had done as a research team over time, in 2017 we started with 0. In 2018 we had 2. In 2019 we had 8. In 2020 we had 7. And in 2021, we actually have 10 projects that are active right now. And this is projects that are completed or nearly done, not projects that are actually underway. And so this is number of research projects completed. The number of research trainees that we had over the period from fall of 2017, so that academic term, through the current academic term of summer of 2021, we started small, and so for the first couple of academic terms, we had no students. Our first student came on board summer of 2018. We had 1 student in fall of 2018, and that grew to 3 students in the winter of 2019, 5 students by summer of 2019, 7 students by fall of 2019, and then 10 students winter of last year, and then 16 in the summer, and then 23 in the fall, and then this year we've had 28 students in the winter term and 25 students currently. And so those are bar graphs that I've illustrated, and I've basically reiterated the same slide, except the blue bars were pre-pandemic, and now the orange bars are during the pandemic. And so what I will point out is that the pandemic actually has not caused us to slow down. If anything, particularly in terms of the number of students, it's caused us to just grow. And that's actually something that we were able to do, because although we had barriers to research during COVID, for example, we could not do in-person data collection, we could not do in-person meetings, there's been no funding for permanent staff, I have a hiring freeze. And we, as with everybody else, had to wrestle with how to do everything virtually. We had a few opportunities. One opportunity is we had new research questions that we could ask, the impact of COVID on, frankly, everything and everyone. The second is we had a virtual supervision opportunity. We had a willingness to take students when others were not sure how to proceed. The third opportunity, and it's not here, actually comes from a systemic way that we had built the research department, because we're the only nonprofit research department that's actively collecting data, but we're also an independent research department that's attached to a professional inclusion and accessibility team. And so because the two teams are working so closely together, the answer to the question how to do everything virtually was also the answer to the question how to do everything in an accessible and inclusive way virtually. And so we knew how to do that, which meant that we had an opportunity that we could capitalize on that most people did not. I will also say that in most other nonprofits, the focus of research is on funding or on data mining, and so it has more to do with curation and knowledge translation than it does to do with knowledge generation. And we've set this research department up to be academic adjacent, if not fully embedded within the academic space. And so our research priorities then for 2021 are threefold. The first of these is education and employment. And so again, we're interested in K-12 educational outcomes, post-secondary outcomes. We've done work on accessibility of online learning. We've done work on employment rates and employment experiences. We're doing work on work integrated learning. And I mentioned the large ASC funded grant, building an evidence-based universal design framework for employment standards in Canada. From the perspective of impact of COVID-19, we care very much about the lived experience of the community of Canadians with seeing difficulties, and the experiences that community has had, that we have had during the pandemic. And so we've run a number of studies to look at that. We've also looked at accessibility of COVID-19 testing centers and vaccine booking. With thanks to Dr. Bonnie Sweener, we've also developed a Canadian version of the COVID-19 vaccine disability dashboard, which we are launching next week. And we've done work on municipal accessibility in COVID-19. And as I said, we're also interested in access to healthcare and services. And so here we've done work on integration of vision loss rehab into healthcare, the guide dog advocacy study. We're doing work on accessibility of healthcare providers. We did a study on accessibility of insulin pump devices. We're doing a study on accessibility of virtual healthcare platforms. And we're planning a study on accessibility of community supports that is forthcoming. And so the department's role then is to field original qualitative and quantitative research. It's to analyze internal and external data sources to produce relevant insights. It's to disseminate knowledge, resource, and tools to understand and leverage the research insights. It's to support locally or externally driven research that is relevant to our mission. And we have two donor endowed research awards that we do provide. One is a trainee award and one is an early investigator award. We also conduct knowledge translation activities. I mentioned Facts and Figures About Blindness in Canada, which is sort of an internal compendium of data relevant to the lived experience, the social determinants of health, the quality of life. We're in the process of translating that into a public-facing resource. Our student research days, we've had two, August of 2020 and March of 2021, and our third student research day is forthcoming in August of this year. And we've also done some research roundtable podcasts, and we have a schedule of publications that will be coming out over the next 6 months. We have a number of ongoing collaborations and research partnerships that we have built, and what's actually listed on this slide is a very partial list. It doesn't include everybody. And so Western University School of Rehabilitation is here, McMaster University School of Rehabilitation is here, George Brown College, OCAD University, Ontario Tech University, the University of Toronto, Queen's University, the University of Ottawa, the Université de Montréal School of Optometry is highlighted because of Walter, and the central role that he's played in our collaborations, and Dalhousie University School of Rehabilitation. We've also had a number of capacity building partnerships with students through student engagement offices on campus at McMaster University, at the University of Toronto School of Public Policy, at Queen's University through the Master of Public Health program, and at McGill University's Masters of Management Analytics program. These are unpaid internships or placements that students have with us. So I'm going to take a little bit of time now, after having told you how we've really built that infrastructure within CNIB, to share some of our key findings with you, and then I will talk about what all of this means in terms of inclusive research in the vision sciences in Canada going forward. So we know from the work that we have done that sight loss is experienced by 5.4% of the Canadian population, 1.5 million people over the age of 15. There is an age-dependent incidence and increase in prevalence, which is not too surprising. There are generational differences that we have found evident within the population. As it relates to lived experience. And so employment and education outcomes and use of technology, attitudes toward technology, all of these differ based on age of onset, severity, number of disabilities, and those are some of the variables that we were able to unpack. Because of how some of the data are collected, and because of how sometimes small our sample sets are, we're not necessarily able to tell you tons about intersectional identity. I would love to say a lot more about ethnicity and sight loss, for example. I would love to be able to say more about membership in an indigenous community and sight loss, for example, but I can't because the numbers in some of the data sets that we're using are too small to be able to do that effectively. I can tell you pre-pandemic, we had an employment rate in 2018 at 42% in working age adults. In 2021, we just measured this 3 months ago, the employment rate is 28%. In working age adults. The employment rates actually negatively correlated with age of onset and severity and number of disabilities that someone lives with. And that's true whether we're talking about the 42% number or the 28% number. Through the Canadian Survey on Disability, we were able to assess how people with visual disabilities or sight loss were accessing help for daily activities. And so I'm going to show you some data that we analyzed via the Canadian Survey on Disability last year before the pandemic hit. And I can say that of all Canadians with seeing disabilities, 55% identified as receiving help with daily activities. And for those who received help, the greatest amount of help was received with heavy household chores, 74% of the population. 68% received help with getting appointments and running errands, 54% with everyday housework, 47% with preparing meals, 41% with looking after personal finances, 27% with personal care, 16% with basic medical care at home, and 15% with moving around inside their residence. We're able to disaggregate by age. And so what I'm going to show on the next few slides are a series of bar graphs that show disaggregation by a few different demographic variables. And what we looked at was the overall number of Canadians with sight loss receiving help and the number of activities that they received help with. And so for example, if you were under 65, 45.2% received help with daily activities compared to 72.6% in the over 65 population. The number of activities that folks received help with, 3.1 on average for under 65, 3.8 on average for over 65. So definitely a distinction, a separation based on age. We also saw separation based on labor force participation. If you were employed, 28.9% received help with daily activities. If you were unemployed, 44.7% received help. And if you're out of the labor force, 77.3% received help. And the number of activities that you received help with, there was also a trend. It was 2.5 activities on average for those employed, 2.4 activities on average for those unemployed, 3.5 activities for those out of the labor force. We also disaggregated based on age of onset. And so just to keep this simple, if you lost your sight before the age of 15, 45.2% of that population received help with daily activities compared to 72.6% of those who lost their sight over the age of 65. I actually think that number is wrong. That number should be higher. It should be 80.1%. And so this was actually a mistake in the graph. I apologize for that. And then the number of activities, 3.1, that I think is, no, that's also wrong. So this graph is incorrect. And so if you lost your sight in childhood, then it's 3.1 activities per person on average that you needed help with. If you lost your sight over the age of 65, it's actually 4.4 activities per person that folks needed help with. We also disaggregated based on number of disabilities. And so again, here, there's a bit of a range. And so if you're blind or visually impaired alone, only 21.6% of people needed assistance, and those people needed assistance with about 2.5 activities per person. On the other hand, if you were blind and visually impaired and you had additional disabilities, then 72% almost required assistance with daily activities, and again 3.6 activities per person. So in each of these cases, age of onset, number of disabilities, and participation in labor force, we were able to identify that each of those variables actually impacted the extent of help received, and the amount of people who were being assisted. I will also tell you that they impacted the quality of help received. And so each of the individual tasks that folks received help with were shifted in different ways in different populations, based on our analysis. I will also share with you some data about the impact of COVID-19. We looked at in the first wave of COVID, we looked at the impacts of COVID-19 on the sight loss community, and I'm going to distill down for you into a 2-slide table the work of a very large survey that we put in the field last April, which was done in collaboration with our friends at the American Foundation for the Blind. So the impact of COVID-19 on employment rates, the employment rate decreased substantially and remains reduced during the pandemic. The impact of COVID-19 on healthcare, we found significant concerns from the survey participants across multiple dimensions of accessing healthcare, which were moderated by severity, employment status, age, dual sensory loss in the presence and absence of other conditions. And when it came to social experiences, the survey respondents reported increased feelings of severe sadness, fear, depression, loneliness, anxiety, and concern about health and well-being, also moderated by severity, employment status, and age. Access to supports was found to be through a variety of means, including CNIB, social media, and a social network. There was a decreased sense of safety taking public transit when we looked at transportation, as well as concerns about accessing needed services because people with sight loss don't drive. Access to information was not significantly affected by the pandemic. People were accessing information through multiple sources, and there was no change in access to technology. We also went on to look at the impacts of life in the pandemic. So after 1 year, and what we did is in a follow-up survey, we asked a number of questions around whether things were more difficult or about the same or less difficult compared to 1 year ago. And so we asked people to compare to the start of the pandemic and say, how are things today? And so what we found was that accessing public spaces and community recreational services, including leisure and sporting activities, the vast majority of respondents had reported that these were more difficult to access today than 1 year ago at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we had 69% who said accessing public spaces was more difficult. 67% said accessing recreational services was more difficult. A secondary group of activities centered around healthcare and essential services and eye care and rehab. And so in these cases, healthcare was more difficult to access by 52% of the population, essential services 46%, eye care 41%, and rehab services 31%. And so not as significant a level of increased difficulty as accessing the community and public spaces, but still a major issue. Accessible information for daily living, 30% said it was more difficult than a year ago. Virtual service platforms, said it was 21% said it was more difficult than a year ago. But I will actually note that there was a high degree of respondents, a large number of respondents who said that this just didn't apply to them, meaning that they were not accessing virtual service platforms at all. And 17% said it was more difficult to access the local pharmacy. And so these particular activities were less difficult than, or the least difficult out of the three. We also looked at concerns that folks had during the pandemic. The biggest concern, and again, it was the same way. Is this an increased concern compared to a year ago, about the same, or a decreased concern? And the biggest concern that was increased was feeling socially isolated, 76%. The second tier of concerns had to do with safety. So safety of yourself at 45%, safety of family members at 45%, navigating your community independently at 38%, and using public transit at 37%. And then the last group of things that folks had concerns about had to do with paying for stuff. And things like voting. And so your ability to pay safely for things in a shop, only 31% indicated that this was of increased concern compared to the beginning of the pandemic. 27% said financial situation, 18% said voting, But again, 31% felt this was not applicable because they didn't feel like they had to vote, and 15% said their housing situation. And so what that tells us then is that the pandemic has been a significant stressor on the community of Canadians with sight loss. And in the beginning, the biggest issues were employment and healthcare and moving around and safety, and access to healthcare and safety, but now also access to public services have become even more significant concerns. Now that we're 15 months into the pandemic, we're repeating that second study actually starting next week, and it will be really interesting to get a sense as to how people are doing with the extra 3 months and the vaccinations being rolled out. So in the last part of my talk, then I want to spend some time actually chatting with you about capacity building and how do we actually increase the number of visually impaired researchers in the vision sciences. And I also want to talk about inclusion in research and what all of that means. And so this comes from some of the work that I do in the idea in STEM space. This concept of the STEM training pipeline, and the basic idea behind this pipeline, we've probably all conceived this in some way, shape, or form. Certainly 10 or 12 years ago, the concept of a training pipeline had been talked about all the time. And so effectively, students come in one side of this in K-12 education, and in general are expected to come out the other side as people who are gainfully employed. And I'm on the panel at 10:10 where we're going to talk about employment and career development, and part of the networking session this afternoon as well, where we can pick up on some of this conversation. But the theory is that students come in one side of this pipeline and come out people who have jobs. And so you go from K-12 to college, undergraduate and CEGEP, to professional and graduate education, to a residency or a fellowship or a postdoc, to employment, and you do all of these things or some of these things and you get a job. But for students with disabilities, and particularly for students with visual impairments, what ends up happening is this is not a pipeline, it's actually more of a funnel. Now, I can't draw a funnel in PowerPoint, and so I drew this as a two-dimensional triangle. So this two-dimensional triangle narrows from a base on the left-hand side to a tiny point on the right-hand side, and goes from K-12 education on the left to employment on the right, just as before. But now there are these thick black diamond-tipped lines that act as barriers in between each stage of education to employment. They're blockages, they're glass ceilings, they're things that we can't get through quite so easily. And so how do we actually remove them then? And so we remove them. Well, actually, before we talk about removing them, let's talk about what they are. So what kinds of blockages? We have transitional barriers, barriers to employment. So, you go for an interview, but you don't get the job, or you don't even get called for the interview. Barriers to entry into programs at college and university, or into professional school or graduate school. Barriers into entry into a program of study where somebody says, I don't think you should do rehabilitation. I think you should do sociology, right? Or I don't think you should do biomedical sciences. I think you should do programming. Or why aren't you studying English instead, or studying French, or studying history? And so those kinds of things come up, and they're called gatekeeping barriers. They're environmental barriers where people will say, I don't think you should do this. And other environmental barriers will include colleagues' attitudes, a design of learning spaces, the design of workspaces, and that it will include lab settings as well, and access to technology and information. During the pandemic especially, we've also had a thing that I would consider to be a large philosophical debate, which is trying to make our online experiences mimic our in-person experiences as much as possible. So what are our proposed solutions then? There's 3 ways to take that funnel that I was telling you about and turn it back into a pipeline. The first way is simply to pour students in one side, filling the pipeline, and you're going to get somebody out the other side, right? The more you pour in, the more you're going to get out. Because you're accepting all of the barriers, but you're just saying, if I flood the system, somebody somewhere is going to make it through. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is to break the glass ceiling, to remove the transitional barriers and to increase the number of trainees moving from one stage to the next in the pipeline. The third is to eliminate the environmental barriers and to foster inclusion by enabling full participation of trainees with disabilities at every step in this process. And my argument to you is you need to do all three, not just one or two. And so what have I done then with the CNIB research team? What we've tried to do is build an inclusive research training environment. And this includes not just me and the team at CNIB, but I'm going to include our collaborators in this as well. And so our job is role modeling. And at CNIB, we do that by having a staff complement on my team that is 100% persons with disabilities. And I'm a department head who has lived experience. So I have gone through all of this as well. Mentoring and sponsorship is the second part of this. And what we do here is we try to make sure that the junior trainees are co-supervised by myself and others on the team who are either staff or senior trainees. And in our conversations, it's not just about research supervision. It's not just about your project. It's also about career development and coaching as well. We strive for belonging and connectedness through a virtual community in our team meetings and through a team social environment. And we also, like I preach, I practice inclusive supervision, both in person when I have the opportunity to do that and virtually as well. And so I will give my trainees the opportunity to talk and to express their perspectives and their opinions. It's a very open environment. And what I strive to do is I strive to supervise the person, not merely the project. And so the last thing that I want to touch on then is very much dimensions of inclusion in research. And when we think about research and we think about inclusion in research, I want us to think about what does that really mean in terms of how we do our work. I want to talk about inclusion in research. So researchers are human beings, right? All of us have a lived experience. All of us have an intersection identity. But I think also the thing is all of us bring a certain amount of baggage to the table. All of us come to the table with implicit biases and preconceived notions and ideas about who can do what based on where we lived and how we grew up. And so it's worth it acknowledging that, because in order for us to do anything about inclusion on our teams, inclusion in the research process, we really need to challenge those biases and check our assumptions. And so we need to ask who's on the team. We need to confront something that when I was a trainee was a very common perspective, which is what I would call color blindness or ability blindness or class blindness or caste blindness or any form of who you are doesn't matter. All that matters is what you do. This was a perspective that was considered to be in vogue in the sciences in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Nobody cared that I'm Indo-Caribbean of South Asian descent, and nobody cared that I have a visual impairment. Except the thing is, I actually wanted people to care. I wanted people to be aware. I wanted people to be color aware or ability aware, because those lived experiences, those aspects of my identity matter to how I do the work. They don't matter in terms of whether I'm able to do the work or the quality of work I produce, but they matter very much in terms of the how. And it matters to me, and it matters to trainees today that we are paying attention. And so we're not oblivious to or blind to someone's intersection identity, but we are aware of it and taking that into consideration in conversation. I also put here a comment that style of thought is the last bastion of diversity. And that style of thought is very much dictated by our background and our experiences. And so when I think about an inclusive team, I think about diversity of knowledge base. I think about diversity of abilities. I think about diversity of skills. I think about diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives, gender, race, culture, and so on. And I take into account everyone's life circumstances. As I said before, my current team is 100% persons with disabilities. My current team is 100% remote work. My previous team was 100% sight loss. And I've spent time and effort investing energy into building teams that are multidimensional and also self-aware, aware of its own level of inclusion and its own level of diversity. I think that's critical to building an inclusive research team. When we talk about inclusion of research, we have to talk about how we're applying our research methods, our recruitment approaches, our data collection approaches, our consent forms, the language in our consent forms. We also have to talk about our research tools, our lab technologies, our survey platforms, our analytic tools and software, our ethics submission software, anything that we as researchers are interacting with, we have to think about, is it accessible? Is it usable? Is it being inclusive to everyone from diverse backgrounds, including persons with disabilities? When we think about inclusion and research, I think about how we're representing inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in our research communications. Are our publications accessible? Is our social media accessible? Is the mainstream media accessibly reflecting the things that we want it to reflect? And then finally, inclusion for research. How do we frame our research questions? And this is an interesting thing, because if we don't ask, we simply will not know. And so if, for example, we do not pay attention to intersectional identity, to race, to gender, to ability, when we are collecting our information, then we have no idea when we do our analyses if any of these lived experiences, the statistical term is variable, if any of these variables will actually make a difference. Will they impact the lived experience? And one of the things that we have seen through the research that we've done within the CNIB research program is that all of these lived experiences matter. Age matters, age of onset matters, severity matters, number of disabilities matters, gender matters. I'm willing to bet you, although I haven't showed you a lot of the preliminary results for this, I'm willing to bet you that ethnicity matters, race matters, right? Cultural perceptions matter. And so if we don't pay attention, we will never know. And I think what that basically means is we need to be thinking about how to pay attention to these problems, how to pay attention to these questions in the design of the work that we're doing. There is, of course, a balance between privacy and confidentiality and an effective understanding of to use the statistical terms, confounders and effects. And it's really important for us to pay attention to all of this in the context of research ethics as well. I believe that the pillars of inclusion in the research that we do boil down to inclusive perspectives, how we frame our thoughts, inclusive teams, accessible documents, inclusive research and methodology design, accessible data collection methods, accessible tools, and inclusive communications. I'm going to tell you one last story before I pull everything together and acknowledge people and wrap up. And that is that there was a conference that I spoke at in November, December of last year, where somebody else had given a talk, and this person was an able-bodied researcher, and they had given a talk on inclusive research. And their version of inclusive research was, we're going to include people with disabilities as advisors to the research project. And I pushed on that, and I said, well, have you considered including people with disabilities as researchers? Either through your trainee program or as actual researchers. And their response was twofold. They said, we don't know where to find them. And even if we did know where to find them, we think that people with disabilities can't understand research concepts. Actually literally said that to me in an answer to a question in a Zoom conference with a couple hundred people. And I pushed back very hard on that. And I said, I don't think that we can really say that people with disabilities can't understand research concepts. That's very, very negative reasoning. And as a result, I've decided to speak out more about how we do inclusion in research. Because I think it is absolutely important to drive that conversation and to make a new research paradigm, not just in our field, not just in rehabilitation or vision sciences research, but across the entire country, even across the entire world. So I'm going to just pull everything together. I've spent time talking to you about capacity building and research. Today, I've told you about inclusion in research. We've talked about the unique kind of relationship and partnership that exists within the CNIB research program, and that intersection between nonprofit and academic. We've talked about the growth of this collaborative network in vision sciences over the past 4 years. We've talked about inclusive research and research into inclusion. I've showed you some important findings and talked to you about the impact of COVID-19 on the research program, and finally concluded with some principles of inclusive research and supervision for you to think about. And so I'm going to acknowledge everybody who's contributed to this work. So team members past and present. My bosses, John Rafferty is the Chief Executive Officer of CNIB, Maria Ash, the Chief Transformation Officer, and those are the two people I report to. Members of my current team, Danica Blackstock, Yvonne Felix, Michaela Knott, Ainsley Latour, and Natalie Martiniello. Past members of the team, Jacqueline Rennebaum, Christine Robbins, and Ruan Van Schmidt, who has a PhD in biomedical research, are listed here. Matisse Hamel-Nealis is a current member who is soon to be a past member because she's moving on at the beginning of July. I'm going to acknowledge our funders, Accessibility Standards Canada and MyTax, and a large number of collaborators. And I don't even think I put everybody on the slide, but the team of collaborators that we have is extremely extensive. And again, I will acknowledge my friend and collaborator Walter Wittich, and also my friend and collaborator Bonnie Sweener, who are also part and parcel of some of the other things that I do. And acknowledge the time that I spend with the Queen's University Faculty of Health Sciences Dean's Action Table on EDI, and the Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Jane Philpott, and Giselle Valarezo, the project manager, the corresponding folks at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine Diversity Advisory Council, the Vice Dean, Dr. Lisa Robinson, and Anita Balakrishna, the head of the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Office. And when it comes to STEM projects and networks, the work on creating a culture of accessibility in the sciences is work that I do very, very much with Ainsley Latour and the International Network of Researchers with Visual Impairments and their allies. I'm going to acknowledge Bonnie and Natalie, who are on the executive committee with me and who co-founded the organization alongside me. So I have I think about 15 minutes for questions and comments and conversation, and I'm very happy to interact with the audience.